Hey there, and welcome back to the Complicated Kids podcast. I'm your host, Gabrielle Nicolay. I am a toddler whisperer, a speech therapist, and a parent coach. And today I've got Christi Hay with me. Christi, Dr. Hay, welcome.
Thank you, Gabrielle.
Dr. Hay is a pediatrician, and I'm going to let her tell you about herself. But I'm just going to say right off the bat, you are not your average pediatrician. So we're going to have a conversation about what we want pediatricians to be like because we all wish that they were more like you. So, Christi,
Oh,
hey, take it away.
oh, Gabrielle, you flatter me, dear. So, first, just a little bit about myself. I am originally from California, and I'm very proud of that. And I think that actually kind of feeds into the kind of practice that I've created here in Washington, D.C. So, I created now 13 years ago Palisades Pediatrics. Yeah, I've known you for 13 years, Gabrielle.
Yeah, long
And
time.
so Palisades, back in 2011, I wanted to create something intentionally small in terms of patient panel. I wanted to have more time with my families, time because I'm super chatty, for me to kind of get out all of my pediatric public health info, time for families to ask me questions. So that was super important to me. And I didn't want to have a lot of barriers between myself and my families and the kiddos that I take care of. And so I wrote a business plan. I had a couple, like literally two really supportive people in my life who said, yeah, go try it. And, here I am 13 years later, and I love what I do. So I have a small practice, um, and I see one family at a time, and I do everything. I don't have a nurse. So I give the shots, I do the vital signs, I do the exam, I do the assessment, I do the plan, and then send folks on their way, right? So well visits typically with me take about an hour, sick visits, 30 minutes. So it's really, really intimate. I know grandmas and aunties and nannies. I know the community. I call my patients my community. My kids would babysit folks in the community. I go to graduations. I go to bar mitzvahs. I go to dance performances. I've been to theater productions. It's really a community
Yeah.
where it's kind of like having an auntie that's your pediatrician.
And
And
this is how
so,
it used to be, right? This before
yes.
like medicine got all privatized and stuff. The
Mhm.
pediatrician was sometimes the person who delivered you or your
Mhm.
parents, right? And
Right.
then was like a part of the community. So the fact that you've been able to create this in nowadays is I first of all, I think it's a testament to your grit and to your persistence, but also clearly to the needs of the community, right? Because that it takes a village to raise a child, right? We need
Yeah.
all the people we can get. So
Yeah.
I just remember
Yeah.
when you were opening your practice, you used to let people text you. And
Hmm.
I thought that was, and this was like, again, 13 years ago, people were not texting at the rate that they text now. But I thought that that was really special. And you could ask a
Yeah.
question of your pediatrician via text and you would get back to them. So
Yeah. Yeah. So I love it, and it really works. And it's not for everyone, and I totally understand that. But it works really well for folks that really want one person to be responsible for the well-being of their kiddo, and they really have to trust me. They only have my two eyeballs in order to kind of come up with stuff. And and so it's a lot of reciprocity. I rely on my families to for histories. I rely on my kiddos for history. I talk a lot to the kids directly, and then the parents, right? Always trust but verify. Um, And I feel that really gives me a fuller, kind of richer history in order to help me in terms of diagnosis and treatment. And then within that space, I really like I like all of peds, but I really like neurocognitive diversity stuff, asthma, allergy, school problems, things in that space make me super happy.
You like the complicated kids.
That's
Um,
right, I
yeah,
do.
yeah. And that's why, you and I have worked so well together over the years. We have cross-referred. We have talked about many, many clients and patients together. And I always come away having learned something from you. I like to think it's the same on your side. But so I say all that to say, again, back to this village idea, particularly when we have complicated kids, but all kids, all of the things that we say on this podcast are true for all children. They're just kind of like
Absolutely.
especially true for the tougher ones. It is really important. And before we hit record, I said, where do you want to go with this conversation today? And you said, I want people to understand what they should expect, what they may expect, what they're allowed to expect from their pediatrician. And so you started us off just now saying, like, you are talking to the kid, you're talking to the parents. Sometimes you're having grandparents come in and you're getting to know the family. But you said some other things, and I want you to recap them here. Like when you're dealing with particularly a complicated kid, but you don't just want to know, like, what did they have for breakfast yesterday? Although certainly you do want to know that. So what are some of the things that you ask that pediatricians should ask and maybe don't always?
So, great question, Gabrielle. So, one of the reasons why I'm a pediatrician and not an internal medicine doctor is I like transition and change, and kids are growing and developing. And they have different developmental milestones throughout the lifespan, right? So, I see kiddos from newborn to 21, and there are changes all along there. And so, for well visits, which all pediatricians do, and that is exactly what a kiddo should be. They should be well. A pediatrician is asking about nutrition and elimination and sleep patterns, right? But one of the other things that should be included in that is developmental screening slash surveillance. And so according to the American Academy of Pediatrics, developmental surveillance is required at all of your visits. Now, I was trained a long time ago, and so I was trained, you did developmental screening, right? So I had to memorize screenings for each age group. They don't do that anymore, but that is where I live. So when I see a well kiddo, I'm doing a developmental screening because I had to memorize that in terms of their gross motor, their fine motor, their personal social, their communication, right? Their problem solving. So I'm kind of running through that, and that takes time. So you're not able to do that all the time at every single visit in a traditional practice, let's say.
Yeah, pause for
But
just a second.
again,
Sorry, I'm gonna
mhm,
stop you there for a second because this is where your practice is a really interesting example, counter example to many pediatric practices, because when you're at a traditional pediatric practice, you see the doctor for maybe 10 minutes. And if they're really good, they stay with you for 20. In that amount of time, it is almost impossible to screen for developmental milestones because kiddo is still getting used to you being in the room. You're unfamiliar to them. They're probably glommed onto parent or whoever brought them that day. And they might, in air quotes, look fine. But when you spend
mhm.
a little bit more time, let that nervous system settle, now you're going to get to see some stuff that you probably can't see in the first 10 minutes. And again, we are 100% aware that not all people have access to and can afford the type of care that we're talking about here. And it's important to hold up models like yours as an indicator of what's possible and what we should be going for. We should not be satisfied with medical care in this country. There, I said it.
Yes, yes, absolutely. So to that point,
Mm.
in a traditional space, they're going to do surveillance. So they're going to ask some high level questions that are appropriate for ages. And then there are certain visits when you do a full screening. And so standardized screening. So they are checking at kind of what we would consider kind of critical points, right? So 9 months, 18 months, so 2.5, so forth. So they are checking and doing that longer screen at these kind of critical ages. But you're right. Since I have more time, I am able to get into the weeds more and ask more specific questions about what they're doing in each of these little developmental spheres. And because of that, when I feel as if someone is lagging behind, I am quick to do a referral. I am all in for early intervention, whether it's speech therapy, occupational therapy, physical therapy. Intervention is real. And I say that because some people feel, well, they're a kid. You just leave them alone, they will develop these skills. And I have found that if my kiddo at 18 months is just babbling and I don't have any consonant sounds and I don't have mama, dada specific, I'm not talking at 2. So speech therapy is really helpful for those kids to start to massaging those neurons so that we can start to get some communication before they're getting frustrated, because there's stuff going on in those brains, but they're having trouble getting those neurons to connect to that tongue, that jaw, the teeth, the top of the mouth to produce those words, right?
This is why
So
I love to work with you. What you just said encapsulates it so beautifully, which is like, you got no consonants at 18 months. And this is a speech and language example. The same holds true for fine motor, for sensory, for gross motor. You don't have a skill at 18 months. We're not going to have what we want at age 2. And notice 18 months, lots of people think that that's too young for speech therapy or any kind of intervention. It is not.
No, ma'am.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I just love
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. So then that can also so development through the lifespan. So that's our early toddler kiddos, right? Then the next space that I totally love is school problems. So now we have a kiddo in school and they're having issues with organization or focus, or they're hyperactive, or they're having lots of sensory processing, auditory processing. So you're saying stuff, but it is not firing in the neurons, right? I love that stuff. And helping the family see that kids, again, why do kids and I don't do adults? Kids aren't stubborn. They're not lazy. They're not hard-headed. And they're not bad, right? They're not being a boy. Not being a boy. So they have an issue. They have something is hard. And when something is hard, kids don't do it. And so we expect that you should be able to develop at a certain rhythm along these different spectrums. And if your kiddo isn't, it's usually on us, I feel, the adults, to identify that and then provide the appropriate intervention. Doesn't mean your kid is not bright and have capacity. This is how they process. And so Um, I love that stuff. My own kiddos had neurocognitive diversity. Um, and so I am fully aware of kind of the challenges, struggles, how a kid can be complicated and how that impacts you as a parent. Um, but that is my jam. I love dealing with that, as you know.
It's amazing. And listen, oh my God, if if nobody ever told me that their kid was stubborn again, I would die a happy, happy woman because, yes, 100% to everything you just said. Rewind this episode about 30 seconds, listen to everything that Dr. Hay just said about they're not stubborn, they're not bad. 100%. Yes, yes, and yes.
Yeah.
And by
Yeah.
the way, this is another area where, we talked a little bit about early intervention. When we get in at 8, 9, 10, right? When kids are just developing metacognitive skills, meaning they are beginning to learn how to think about thinking, they're beginning
Mm-hmm.
to self reflect. If we get in there and say to them, turns out your brain works a little bit differently from what we might expect, or here's how your brain does math. Here's how your brain does social. Here's how your whatever, right? And we
Yep.
can give that to them and name it for them and with them so that they can understand their own brains. Now we've got a young adult who's growing up to accept themselves, to like themselves, to understand what accommodations they need, and to advocate for themselves rather than hiding out in the corner thinking there's something wrong with them.
Yep.
Because that is
Absolutely.
unnecessary.
Mm-hmm. And to me, unacceptable. So everyone has a gift, right? So parents have kids and you have these dreams for these kids, right? But then there's actual reality, what we get. And the sooner we adapt to the child in front of us, the better everyone is. Because the kid with a learning difference knows that they have a learning difference before we do. They're in the class. They notice other kiddos raising their hand, saying things, giving answers, and they're like, how did they know that? How did they do that? And they're not able to do it. They're not able to write, or they have thoughts, but it's challenging to get them down on paper, or they're looking at words and they're not understanding how some people are able to make sounds and give a word and they can't do it. Or they're trying to sit down and their body physically will not let them stay in the seat, right? So they know. And a lot of the times, Gabrielle, I agree, telling them, finding out what's wrong, telling them, hey, you know what? Your brain works this way. These are the things that we need to do to help you be successful. And it's our job as the adults to kind of shape and change the environment so you can show what you know, because you know a lot, but you may not be able to show everything in 30 minutes. But man, you may get it all right in an hour. That's fine. No rush. We can do it. And that can help them decrease the temperature and be like, oh, I knew something was going on.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And that is my jam. I love figuring that out so kids aren't struggling, so they aren't super exhausted, right? It takes a lot to go to school and like learn and interact with peers and interact with teachers. And if you have neurocog diversity where that can be challenging, you get home, and these are the kids you probably see, and you just fall apart. You're done. You're like, no, held it together at school. You're going to get all the goodies. Okay. I'm going to have a tantrum. I'm not eating this. I'm not going to go to sleep. I'm not going to take a bath. I'm not going to brush my teeth. I'll pick whichever power struggle I want to pick. You're going to get it all, parents.
Yeah.
And then you're like, what? So figuring it out, and to your point, letting them know that everyone has a gift
Mm-hmm.
and everyone's brain is different helps to start to slowly turn the tide.
What I hear you saying is in your practice, and again, I'm just pointing this out because I think people don't necessarily expect this from their pediatricians anymore. I think they used to. Is you are as much a support for the child. In some ways, you are as much a support for the child and their well-being as you are for the parent, as you are for the family. Because you're really taking a very holistic view of, again, like, what is this like for you, mom? What's happening at school, right? You're asking these questions because you are not, as much as you're talking about seeing the child in front of you and how, and I agree with you, like we got all kinds of dreams that were born when we got pregnant with our kids, or when we were in process getting our children, and then they arrive and we're like, oh, you're an actual person. But
Yep.
what I hear you saying also is you want to know who's actually in front of you. And that includes knowing what they're like at school and what they're like at home, and then also what they're like in your office. Yeah?
Yeah. No, absolutely. When I can, I like to get as many different data points as possible. I like to read school reports, the narratives. I like to read over a speech therapy report when they send them, or an OT report. I definitely love to read psychoeducational testing and neurocog testing. I read those things like a book. And so, because it's helpful, it's letting me see, okay, how did my kiddo look in front of you? How do they look when they're with you, right? And then putting those pieces together, is fun stuff.
It's so good. I mean, you and I both think
Yeah.
it's really fun. And listen, if you're listening to this and you're like, this is not fun for me, find a practitioner who thinks it's fun. Because there's so much, and to your earlier point about that everybody comes with a gift, right? And that, thank God we're not all the same. Thank God all of our brains don't work the same, because we would be walking around in a pool of gray.
Yeah.
Right? And so often the kids who are the most challenging are the most sparkly, are the most creative. And this is not always the case, right? Not everybody's a savant, and not everybody's a brilliant artist, and that is
Yeah.
awesome also. But like to touch the essence of another human, particularly a child,
Yeah.
is, for me, and I know for you also, right? It's like one of the greatest, most fun things there is to like really see this person.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if we can expect that from our pediatrician, like, life is so good, you know?
I think another piece also, and I'll share um, my own personal story, Gabrielle. So, um, I have two girls. My oldest was diagnosed at the age of, I want to say she was probably 6, with attention deficit. She was a daydreamer. She was looking at the butterflies out the window. Um, Executive function. She didn't trust patterns at all. Okay. And some sensory processing. And my younger child had none of these issues. Both had, very high capacity. I have in my office a picture that you can kind of see behind me in the hallway. At their school, they do a lot of art. And when in the second grade, they do a picture, Gabrielle, about depth. So there's mountains, there's a house, there may be clouds, a sky. So my younger kid, who has no learning issues, I had her painting hanging up in the exam room for years. And she is now graduated from college, and she is a computer science major. And if you just see her image, everything is exact. There are 4 mountains, and they have ice, snow at the top, and that's perfect. And there is not a speck of white. Everything is fully covered. The sky is the same color, blue. The green grass is the same color. Everything is exact. And that's how she is. She's a mathematical person. I was cleaning out. We had moved and we had some photos, framed photos in the garage, cleaned out and found the second grade photo of my oldest kid who has attention deficit, sensory processing, executive function, it went to the same school. So she had the same assignment, depth. Hers, if you look at it, Gabrielle, it looks like she's kind of scribbling because she had some fine motor stuff, okay? But if you really focus, because there's plenty, it looks like scribble. If you really focus, there are multiple houses. There's a bird in a tree. There's a well with a bucket. There are the mountains. The sky is sunset. There's some yellow, there's some orange. It's not a perfect circle. It's just kind of the sky, right? And so you can see that she was very detailed within the, looking more scribbly than her sister. She named it, right? She gave her picture a title, which her sister didn't do. That one is a writer. She's a creative. And if she was that way from the very beginning, right? Yeah, she had some penmanship stuff, and yeah, she couldn't really organize, but she's a creative. She can write you under the table, and she can create a story. Her sister, very 1, 2, 3, 4 mathematical. Yeah. Same house, very different brains, needed to be approached very differently. And I show that to you. So I'm very transparent with my community. I'm like, look, your kid is going to be okay. You're going to find what their gift is, and they'll thrive in that. The things that they don't like, yeah, it's going to be hard. It's going to be a lift. You got to do some work. I think sometimes parents don't realize you have to do some work in order to support your kiddo to get through things, but they're going to be okay. And I think that is helpful when they realize, your pediatrician walked the same walk. And with the schools, we had to do extra therapies, and these things are helpful. Yeah. So I think that also helps in terms of what you're mentioning, the relationship, caring for the kiddo, the family, the community, when they see, I'm not separate from the community. I'm not just telling you things to do. I'm up in here with you. Yeah. I've done the same thing. I know it is hard, right? But even as a pediatrician, I didn't pick it up. I wasn't like, I looked at my kid and was like, oh, you have executive function and da-da-da-da-da. I didn't do that. Yeah. And so I was just like, oh, things are just really hard with Catherine. That was just like, oh, I guess that's just how it is. And it wasn't until we had her tested and the teachers were kind of like, so that's why I think the school environment is helpful. The teachers were like, for the level of language and cognitive skills, some of these really simple things she's not able to do. Mm-hmm. And so
this is a good time to
people see that.
Yeah, and I want to pause there for just a second, and then we're going to wrap, and I'm going to ask people how they can find you and whether you have openings and all of that. So be prepared. But there is this notion that that intelligence or like brain function is uniform, and that like if your kid is smart, that's the same thing or the same skill set as being able to turn in your homework on time, get a multi-step project done, research a paper. And I want to tell you, those are not the same. There are
No.
discrete, the older we get, the more discrete areas of cognitive development develop, um, where, right, so speech and language is one aspect of brain development that is separate from and separated from thinking skills. They look real close together when kids are very small, right? When kids are a year
Hmm.
old, those two things are almost the same. But they become more and more differentiated. And so, in the same way, when you're talking about executive function, and we've got lots of episodes on executive function on this podcast that you can listen to, those are discrete skills from, for example, subject matter. I might be really good at
Yeah,
math and never remember to turn in my homework. But
that's
that
right.
confuses parents often.
Yeah.
And the
Oh,
thing
yeah,
I, right?
absolutely.
Yeah. And so I think it's brilliant that, your patients have access to you who knows, no, 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 those are different skills. Like,
Yeah. Yeah. And I usually, and you're right, that's usually how, what something that they'll say, um, they're really good at this. They're able to do this. They're able to do such and such, but they can't do such and such. So they can't have this neural cog. And I'm like, oh no, that's exactly what it is. so, so
yeah.
no, absolutely. And I really stress it's not about capacity.
Mm-mm.
This is different.
Yeah.
Yes, your kid is able to learn and they're bright, but we need to create an environment that they're going to be successful and not frustrated and stressed out about it, right?
Yeah.
And there's nothing new. And that's the other thing I tell parents, to your point earlier, if you look along the family tree, someone's going to have a brain like the kid, right? And I just say, remember how it was? Someone along the tree going to school was hard and you were successful because you put in time, um, work, you didn't get sleep. And we're now saying that's not healthy. You don't have to do that anymore because we realize your brain is fine. It's the environment that needs to adjust to your kiddo's brain. And when we know better, we should do better. So just because you struggled doesn't mean your kid needs to struggle,
That's right. That's right.
right?
We know so
So,
much more. I mean, child development just as a field wasn't even a
mhm,
field until
right.
like, pretty recent memory. Like, we didn't think
Mhm,
it was a serious discipline to study children until very recently ago.
right,
So the fact that
right.
all of this, that we do know better from one generation to the next, or even two generations to the next, yeah, there's new information in child development. We know a lot more about brains than we used to, and there is a lot of outdated information still out there. And so, again, the fact that you are embracing this very modern model of brain development, are tracking this so beautifully and closely with your patients, is like, it's so good. It just makes me so excited.
So let me say this for a more traditional space, because I know your podcast is seen by a range of folks.
Mm.
So in a traditional space, because I used to work in one of those two, what a parent should do at a minimum is at each well visit, you should ask, because you may not be told, is my kid age appropriate? And in terms of their development. And then you can also ask, do you have any concerns about my kids' development for their age? Right. And so that will at least have a little bit of a discussion about what they're doing in terms of their developmental milestones. And then when a kiddo is in school, most pediatricians may not ask about kind of what's happening in school, but if you have a school issue, if you've had a parent teacher conference and someone mentions some concerns about your kiddo, please mention that to your pediatrician, because then they can be involved in referring you to services, right? And so you can self-refer as well. Your teachers can recommend it, and your pediatrician can be involved in that also. So that's for your school age kiddo. So once they hit pre-K 4 on through, you would bring to your pediatrician any school concerns or behavioral concerns that they may be experiencing. So that way, at least in those, to your point, those very brief well visits that you should be doing every year, if your provider isn't telling you about any developmental issues, I wouldn't assume there aren't any. So you should at least ask.
Yeah, I love
Is
that.
my kid age appropriate? Do you have any concerns about my kiddo's development? And so that can at least start the conversation, and put it on their radar that you're interested in that.
Yeah, love it.
So that would be my suggestion.
That's fantastic. That is really good advice. Thank you. If people want to find out more about your practice and about you, how do they do that?
So, in terms of my community, they could go to my website, palisadespeds.com. For my community, I am small, and so I actually meet with families that are interested in learning more about what I do. And families are invited to join my community if I feel that we would be a good fit. And it's also based off of the spaces that I have. So I have at times can have a wait list, and based off of the movement can bring new families into the community. So right now I do have some space, so I can do some initial visits and chat with people, but that fluctuates depending on what's going on.
Okay, perfect. And we will link to your website in the show notes. Christi Hay, it's always such a fun time to talk to you. Thank you for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you, Gabrielle. It's always lovely to chat.